I'm Camille Weber. We are here at Linfield College with Bill Fuller, co-founder of Tualatin Vineyards, and it is August 11th, 2015. So my first question for you, Bill, is why wine?
Well, it was kind of accidental in a way. It was when I graduated from college in 1958, I was not certain about what I wanted to do, and so I decided to look into teaching. Even though I had a bachelor's degree in chemistry and completed a major in math and had a minor in physics, I could have done a lot of different things. And so I went to work as a school teacher in Cloverdale in Northern California. Well, the president of the school board was the office manager at Italian Swiss Colony Winery in Asti, just 4 miles south of Cloverdale. And he told the winemaker that they had hired a person with a degree in chemistry, and the winemaker had always told him he was always short of part-time help in the lab. So they called me, and I went down and was interviewed, and they hired me to work during the harvest of 1958. So that was really my first job in the wine industry, and I worked that harvest evenings and weekends. And then when the school year ended, I enjoyed teaching, but I didn't care for the position I was in. And I really financially couldn't move on to another place, and the way the school salaries were structured. So anyway, so I went down to the winery and said that I'm looking for a job. And they said, well, you know, we have an opening, but you don't quite qualify for what we've put in the requirements of the job, but we know you, we know your work ethic and whatnot, you're hired. So that was my intro to the wine industry. So got started that way, and it just went from there.
So how did you make the transition from California, doing winemaking in California, and then eventually moving to Oregon?
Well, the job at Italian Swiss was a very difficult one for me because I was supervising bottling operation at night, and I think they specifically hire hardened criminals to work the night shift because I was constantly having problems with things like the night watchman would come and say, Bill, you got to go into the parking lot. Well, why do I have to go in the parking lot? Well, you got to go in the parking lot because you need to look. So I go in the parking lot, and here's a forklift driver loading his trunk of his car with cases of wine. He drove them from the warehouse out there, and it was just a lot of stuff like that. And I, I'm only 21 years old, so how do I deal with it all? I wasn't a hardened worker, myself. So I thought, well, I want to try something else. So I went to work for Crown Cork and Seal, and they produced supply things like cans and crowns and screw caps that went to the beverage industry. So I still had a connection with wine and beer and whatnot. Well, the engineer there was a wine nut, and he kept after me, get back in the industry, So then I decided, okay, I did like the wine industry part. So I went back to my boss at Italian Swiss Colony and said, I'd like to get back in the wine situation. I said, what would you do if you were me? And so he said, well, you can do one of three things. He said, I can hire you back, which I'd be really happy to do. You could befriend somebody in the wine industry and shadow them on weekends and stuff, learn from them. Or you could go back to school and get a degree. And I said, well, if you were me, what would you do? And he says, go back to school and get a degree. So that's what I did. I went in 1960, let's see what year, that was 62. I went back to school at Davis and was there for 2 years. And at that time, there were two other students there that came to Oregon, Dave Lett and Chuck Corey, and I knew them long before anybody did here. They talked about it a lot and whatnot. And so I had that interest kind of in the back of my mind. And then they left the school and took off and went to Europe and did some other things. And so then I finished after 2 years, and my thesis wasn't accepted. And so I had to work on it some more, but I needed to get back to a job. And so I was hired by Louis Martini to go to work for them. And I was the first non-family member that they'd ever hired in the winemaking part. And so I went there in '64. Well, then in the spring of '65, I got my thesis squared away and accepted. And so I got my master's degree in 1965. And so during that 10-year period, I was there at Louis Martini. A lot of people passed my way. Sort of the guru of the Western world of wine was Dr. Maynard Amarine at Davis. And he had kind of a list of favorite people, and I was one of his favorite people, which helps. That every time somebody would come by and say they're looking to get in the wine business, he had this list, and he would just give these names to these people, and they would go talk to. So I got all kinds of people passing by, and looked at, had a chance then, because of that, to look at a lot of properties myself, so one place that really intrigued me was Anderson Valley in Mendocino County, near the Boonville area. And so there was this couple, and they actually bought based on my recommendation there. And so it kind of kept touch with them and what was going on. And then Bill Malkmus, who eventually I partnered with, he was one person that came off the list too. And he came to talk with me, and we talked. And that went on for a year and a half or so. And then he had decided that he was going to get serious about it, and actually approached me to sort of partner with him and whatnot. And so we went and looked in Anderson Valley because I was pretty high on it at that time. And so the place that Navarro Vineyards is at, we looked at, and we decided that we wanted to buy it. But my wife refused to move there. And so that kind of killed that project, But anyway, life goes on. But so we then walked away from that one. And then in the meantime, some people from Oregon had come down and met with me. Dick Erath was one that he wasn't in the wine business yet. He was working Tektronix at that time.
In Oakland, correct?
Yeah, and so he came down, and then the Roseburg group had they were a little more organized, and a busload of them came down, and I took them on some tours and whatnot. And so anyway, so then when Bill Malkmus and I began to look around, we looked down south of San Francisco where Ridge is and some of the other wineries down there. We looked in the Sierra foothills, we looked in eastern Washington, and we looked at Oregon property. Well, in the meantime, I was hired as a consultant for a possible wine project in Oregon. And this would have been 1970. And so I'd made a couple of trips up here looking at properties with this group. And then I made a couple of recommendations. In fact, one of the places I recommended to them is now where Bethel Heights is, and that property was for sale at that time. And so anyway, then in 1972, at the harvest time, one of the grape growers that delivered grapes to us at Martini said that he was, after harvest, he was coming to see his brother-in-law who lives in Scappoose. And so there was an ad in Wines and Vines magazine that said, grape land for sale in Oregon. And I'd looked at that ad carefully and called the people, talked to them. So then I asked this grower, I said, I don't know where Forest Grove is, I don't know where Scappoose is, but maybe they're not too far apart. And you could go and look at this piece of property and see what you think. Well, it turns out, Scappoose isn't that far from Forest Grove. So anyway, he went and looked. And when he came back, after visiting with his brother-in-law, he came and saw me right away. And he says, Bill, he said, I think that's a fantastic spot. He said, I think it's really good. Yeah. So then I talked to Malcolmus about it. And he then came up here and met with the people to talk about costs and, the money part of it, because that was his role in this whole thing. And so then November of that year, at Thanksgiving time, I came up. So everybody had looked at it before I had, and I had to live there, so I needed to go look. So anyway, I went up and looked and decided that was fine. And so then in the spring of '73, I quit Martini in April, and I came up and I lived with Chuck Corey just outside of Forest Grove, where David Hill is. And I stayed with them and worked on problems at the property, getting it ready and whatnot. The house had been abandoned and needed a lot of work, and we had to prepare the land to plant, had to find plants. There were not a lot of plants available in those days. So then we planted in May, and I waited till my children had finished school that school year in St. Helena, and so they came up over 4th of July weekend, moved up to the property at Forest Grove, and so that's in '73 is when that started, and the rest is history.
So you talk a lot about looking at different locations to set up the site. What exactly are you looking for when you're looking at these areas?
Well, first of all, the area is unknown to me initially, and so you have to kind of get up to speed with the area. And fortunately, this project in 1970, this other potential wine project, gave me that opportunity, because one of the persons that I went around with was an old-time farmer in the Willamette Valley. So I learned a lot about what to look for in climate and slope and the differences in soils. Mm-hmm. If you draw a line from Mount Hood straight west, the soils north of that line are different than the soils south of that line. Right. And see, all the Dundee Hills and whatnot have red soil, and we didn't have red soil. Then we had basalt and sand and whatnot. And this is why phylloxera never was as serious a problem in our vineyard like it was in a lot of the Dundee Hills vineyards, because of the clay. We didn't have clay, and we had sand. And our soil was 25% sand. And so anyway, I learned that the warmest place on the slope is the interface with the valley. And as you go up, it just keeps getting cooler and cooler. So I felt I wanted something that was low on the hills, not high. And so the bottom of our vineyard there at Tualatin was 175 feet elevation, and the top of the vineyard was 450 feet. And so that made a nice, long, gentle slope, and was south-facing, breaking west. So, everything was just perfect. And that's one of the best ripening sites. Now, if the whole area ripens, everybody ripens. But if you get the areas, the years where ripening is marginal, that vineyard will shine, because it'll ripen them when others won't. because of the air and it's in a cul-de-sac of hills that make a U shape, and so the warm air collects in there, and so we had a much better shot at getting ripe in the bad years. It's like the local farmers up there, they sort of look down their nose at grapes, and they said, "What are you going to do in the year of the green tomato?" And I said, "Well, I guess we pick green grapes." Yeah, how can you react to that? Yeah. But the one thing that was kind of interesting, exciting, if you went in the Napa Valley and you were looking at a site to plant a vineyard, you would talk to people around you, what kind of grapes do well here and what do there. Well, the neighbors. Up there, we were the neighbors. Yeah. And so we did the planting. Yeah. And you learn a lot when you do these things. One of the grape varieties that I planted was Flora. Flora is a cross between Semillon and Gewürztraminer that was developed at UC Davis. In the Napa Valley, it was one of the earliest ripening grapes. At Martini, there was a vineyard of it back behind the winery toward the river, and it was always one of the first picked vineyards. So I thought, early ripening grape, cool climate in Oregon, good choice. It was the last grape we picked, and it was barely ripe. And so, you don't know. But it has to do with we learned with time, the heat profile. When does the heat come? Well, the heat in the Napa Valley it comes at the end of ripening. It comes in September and October. Our heat comes in July and August. It doesn't come in September and October. So that heat profile has more of an impact on the whole thing. And at Davis, they developed the degree day system. I don't know if you've heard about that, but it's a method where you look at the average temperature through the growing season and you come up with degree days. And so the degree days, like in Burgundy, are 2,400 degree days. Forest Grove's about 2,300. The Geisenheim's about 1,800, and we know grapes will ripen at Geisenheim, but it's the north latitude in that case. So anyway, that Dr. Winkler, who was the guru of the Western world in grape growing, and I spent some time with him when I was a graduate student, and he was emeritus at that time. And he told me, he said, Bill, he said, he did the degree day system. It's his system. And he said if he was to do it all over again, he would only look at the last 6 weeks before harvest, which would fit this concept with the flora that we had, because if you would have looked at the last 6 weeks before harvest, he's recognizing how critical that is to finishing the grapes up. Yeah. And anyway, kind of rambling.
It is totally fine. A few moments ago, you mentioned Charles Corey and David Lett. I was wondering if there are any other names that, or any other people that you had relationships with, and maybe expand on your relationships with Charles Corey and David Lett.
Well, as I assume at this point in your interviews and whatnot, you've gotten the controversy that existed between them and sort of their opinions of each other and so on and so forth. That, well, of course, when I arrived here, their differences were sort of at their peak, you might say. And let me just back up just a second. Dave Lett's cuttings for his Chardonnay were made in my backyard in St. Helena. He got those out of the tree, got those the plant material out of Draper Vineyard, and brought them down to where my house was. And him and my first wife sat in the backyard and made all the cuttings for the Chardonnay. the first ones that he brought. Yeah. And but probably the big difference between the two, and this might be somewhat controversial and maybe come back and bite me in the butt or something, but that the difference between the two was significant. And first of all, Dave Lett was very slick, very smooth. Everybody liked him, the public. Some industry people didn't have the same feelings. The Chuck Corey was very rough on the edges. He could offend very fast. But the significant difference that impacts the industry, and a lot of people, I don't know if they agree with this necessarily or whatnot, but I feel very strongly about it. Chuck Corey wanted to create an industry. Dave Lett wanted to create Dave Lett. And that's a fundamental difference between, and so Dave Lett was very busy cultivating his project and his winemaking and so on and so forth, and he did that initially by being a book salesman at all the universities, and the universities are very susceptible to things like wine and whatnot, and so he was very slick about selling books to them and wine at the same time, or the concepts. Chuck Corey was interested in getting more acreage of vineyard planted because he felt that you needed a critical mass to create an industry. And unfortunately, some of his approaches were not very good, and they didn't do as well as one would have liked them to do. Then my partner would have killed him about half a dozen times because we bought grape plants from him. And Dick Erath was a partner with Chuck in that grape nursery business that they started. And finally, Chuck's approach to things and whatnot caused their separation to occur. And but a funny thing, incident that I remember happening was there's a swimming hole out at Balm Grove, which is near Gales Creek, just over the hill from where Tualatin is. And we would take the kids over there and go swimming and whatnot a lot of times. And so Shirley Corey was one to go around and sweep up all the messes that Chuck made, and she was, let's have harmony here and whatnot. And so she said, let's all meet over, because we're at a point that things were really tough. So she said, well, let's all meet at Balm Grove and have a picnic and potluck and whatnot. Okay. So we'd go over there. Well, Bill Malkmus, my partner, was up from San Francisco where he lived, and he had a friend with him, and the friend brought a dog. And so this beautiful black lab, and so we were there, and Chuck typically was always late to these things. Shirley was there, and then her children, and all of us, and so this dog was retrieving everything you could throw out on the pond. Chuck arrives, and so he sees this retrieving going on, so he takes his hat off and throws it out on the lake. The dog refused to go get it, and so this is kind of Chuck, But anyway, it's the way things happen.
So being the third establishment to open in Washington County, was there any camaraderie between you and the other fellow winemakers in the area?
Yeah, there was, and Dick and I shared equipment. because a lot of the equipment, like labeling wine bottles and hand doing these jobs, that piece of equipment sits there for 10 months and you use it for 2 weeks or something, and so we would buy one together and then just work our schedules out so that Dick had it when he needed it and we had it when we needed it, and we did a number of things that way. And then there were some things that we did in our vineyard that I really brought up from California, and a lot of people in the industry started using them. Was now you see those grow tubes in the vineyard, newly planted vineyard. Well, we were the first to do anything like that, and I went up to Longview and bought misprinted gallon milk cartons, and we put milk cartons out at every place, and we were the first one to do that, and the grow tubes are more effective because of the height of them and whatnot, and but we did that. We were the first vineyard to have a drip irrigation system in it. We had a number of things. We were the first winery to have regular wine tasting hours. No one else had it. Other people had tasting rooms, but no. And then was my wife and myself and the Blossers. We created, and Jack Myers, who has passed away, unfortunately. But there was a discovery brochure called Discover Oregon Wines. Mm-hmm. We did the first one, and there were 5 wineries in it. And Let was pissed because what happened was we required you to have a tasting room hours to be in it. There was no point in sending people there if you're not open. Right. Well, he recognized the importance of that as a directory of, first really sort of directory of Oregon wineries, but he didn't want to have a tasting room. And so this caused a riff a bit, but it's interesting that then one of our members at that time, and I can't think of the guy's name now, he worked for Boise Cascade, and he got Boise Cascade to donate all the paper for that first project, because we had no money and we're trying to do these things on beg, borrow, and steal, and so he actually got them, and Jack Myers, who was a graphic arts specialist at the Oregon Art School, and he got a lot of donated stuff for layout and design, and there was a photographer in Vancouver who had a lot of pictures of the industry, and so we used his pictures, and then we lost all those. He was the photographer that was killed when the volcano exploded in St. Helens. And so we lost all the pictures we had initially. But anyway, so that was the first brochure, and as I recall, there were 5 wineries in it. And Marge Volstek worked on that, and so did Schaefer. What was her first name? Linda Schaefer. And then it was actually kind of the Washington County Gals, we called it, that really put the first brochure together. But there was a lot of cooperation. The thing that ultimately probably caused more problems, in terms of not just, I won't say not getting along, but just problems, was the fact that the mass occurred here in Yamhill County.
Right.
Yeah, and you can understand why. 99W comes right through here, brings all the people. To get to Tualatin, you had to want to go. You weren't going to drive past it. And so that created some difficulties. Then the industry people here use that mass, to promote themselves very well. We made some efforts at promotions, but it just never came off that well because of the location primarily. You could spend 3 or 4 hours here and visit as many wineries as you wanted almost, And in our area, it took 3 or 4 hours to get around the whole area to see only 2 or 3 wineries. Yeah, and so you saw this sort of thing happening. But I can't say that there was any serious rifts. And so then some people on the border, like Ponce and Elk Cove, they had a tendency to associate with the Yamhill people because they were closer than anyone else in Washington County, even though the 2 of them are in Washington County. And that's understandable. I can see that. I might do the same myself if I was in that position. Yeah. But it was exciting times, I have to say.
So my final question for you before we take our little break, and then we'll have Rich come in and ask a few questions, is I want to hear more about the differences and maybe similarities between working in California versus Oregon.
Well, they're so different. They're like 2 different worlds because here we were establishing an industry in effect, and then heaven knows I spent thousands of hours working on that. And I did the lobbying for the wine growers in the early days because we couldn't afford one. Everybody kind of pitched in, but I sort of had the brunt of it. Simon and Blosser, and they were particularly helpful. The thing is that you're so busy trying to start a business and trying to get an industry going and be successful, and what determines that success. And most of us were undercapitalized. There was really no one had a lot of money. Where in California, you had the opposite of all those things. You had a lot of people coming. And when I started the industry in California, it wasn't attracting big amounts of money like it was when I left. That in the 60s, it just expanded and exploded. By the end of the 60s. And the other thing, here we were trying to establish a business. There, all of those, not all, but most of the new wineries, these people weren't in the wine business. They were buying a lifestyle. They could get on the social pages of the Chronicle, they could be in Sunset Magazine, blah, 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 So they brought money from somewhere else that they made, and so they weren't creating what one would call a legitimate business. They were creating their lifestyle. And we had this saying about to make a small fortune in the wine industry, you start with a bigger one. And so the parameters of that whole thing there was so foreign to the parameters that were here that it's very difficult to think. And winemaking here was not all that easy either because, the impression people get of the industry today is that all these places make great Pinot Noir, Well, they don't make great Pinot Noir. Some sites are going to make better Pinot Noir than other sites, let's face it. And those kinds of things hadn't been established when we started. And it's beginning to even still not showing every place like they possibly could be. I remember the Northwest Enological Society started in Seattle in 1976, I believe it was. And I was the Oregon representative to them. So they started with a big program event at Seattle Center, where the Space Needle is. And so I was in charge of the program. So I got Andrei Chelichev, who was America's big guru winemaker, and I got Leon Adams, author, books and whatnot. And I got Chaz Nagel, who was in the dairy department at Washington State at Pullman, but he also did wine things. And he grew up in St. Helena, and I had known him for a long time. So I got him, and then was myself, the four of us on a panel. And I had found 6 wines for the audience to taste, and we would taste with the audience, talk about the wines. Well, the sad part was finding 6 really good wines in the Northwest, and the thing that even made it worse was I made a few of them, but and so it was not always easy, but that I think back, and I feel my 2 biggest contributions to the industry here. One publicly impacted, and the other one internally impacted. The publicly impacted thing was primarily Bill Blosser and I, and my ex-wife gave us some support for paperwork and whatnot, getting the blue signs, the directional signs. And I made a trip to Washington, D.C. to testify to a Senate subcommittee on that. And because, see, all of these roads have federal money in them. And if there's any federal money in the highway, the feds control the signs and whatnot go on them. So, so I went back to testify at the Senate subcommittee, and the senator, and I don't remember his name now, from Vermont, his statement to me was that we don't have a problem in Vermont. Why do you have a problem in Oregon? He didn't like my answer. I said, you, and I pointed at him. I was very emphatic. You got an exemption from the rules for your state, so you don't have a problem. We don't have the same exemption, so we have a problem. Yeah. He didn't say another word the rest of the whole hearing, and it was. Then the other thing I feel that was important for the industry is, we had 2 organizations. We had the Wine Growers Council of Oregon here in the Willamette Valley, and in Roseburg you had the Oregon Wine Growers Association. Their direction and the way they got started was very social. Paul Bjelland was sort of the pusher of that group, and he got them started with Summers, but they began to get some people more interested in more technical kind of things, and the group here was almost purely technical. There was no public things particularly. And so it became apparent we needed to do some legislative things, because we were running into some rules that were problems in terms like having a second tasting room. We couldn't have a second tasting room. And so Reese was president that year. We had a big meeting at the Swept Wing in Albany, right at the end of the airport there. And we had the Roseburg people were there, and all of us were there. And Blosser and I decided that we wanted to manipulate this meeting so that we could get 2 organizations into one organization. Because Markley, who was a senator from Roseburg, he said that I'll support your legislative activities, but I'll only do it if you have one organization. I don't want 2 organizations saying they represent the wine industry. I want one. So that was our impetus to put it together. So we did. And the two people that were really getting to want to get something better was Scott Henry and Werner Anderson. And Anderson was a dentist with a vineyard, and he was also in the state house from Roseburg area. So we talked with them, and they agreed that they would convince their people to merge with ours, but we wanted their name because we felt that Wine Growers Council of Oregon was a much better name than the one that we had. But anyway, so that happened at the Swept Wing, industry-wise. So then the next year I was president 3 times, really, through the years. The next time I was president, I had a goal, one, to create the wine board, to have a public relations firm represent us, to have an office. We didn't have an office. Here, now we're talking early 80s, and we have no mailing address. Well, we had a mailing address. We had one of these mail places, that you can collect your mail at. That's all we had. And we wanted a lobbyist. So we met. The state owns a kind of like a convention center at Silver Falls, and we met there, and we got everybody together and hammered out what we were going to do, and then that we created the Wine Advisory Board concept that day. We hired Bill Nelson to be our lobbyist. We hired Fred Delkin to be our PR firm and use his office as our mailing address and office, so we could get people, so we could respond to people that wanted to find out things about the industry. Mail them a brochure, whatever. Well, Fred's office did that, and that, you look back on things you win and things you lose. Well, I did lose one there, and then I felt it was big. Others didn't agree. But anyway, as Adelsheim was insistent that the monies that we collect for the Wine Advisory Board, that would go half for research and half for marketing. Well, I wanted more money for marketing and less for research. And so finally, we hammered out this thing that a fourth could go to marketing and a fourth could go to research, and the half could move either direction depending upon what the pressures were of the time. And so then we decided to have a vote, and Adelsheim sent a letter out to the industry, encouraging them to go for this particular concept. Yeah. So I sent Adelsheim a note. I said, Dave, I'll go toe-to-toe with you in any kind of verbal discussion you want. But I said, I can't beat your pen, So anyway, it happened what happened to him. But Nelson was very good. He created the legislation for the two, and he separated the money part from the creation of the Wine Advisory Board, so that if for some reason, and we've had to fight it off a couple of times, that people objected to the tax for the board and say they got that altered, they couldn't alter the board because they weren't the same piece of legislation in the statute. So and I thought that was one of the most clever things that happened, when Nelson spearheaded that one. Yeah, but I think those two things were probably the most important things. I did a lot of other things, but those two I thought were critical to the future of the industry. And that was my whole goal, was to create an industry. I remember we got in a long discussion about the allocation of this marketing money. So then I got on the board, and I was in charge of marketing for the wine board for a long time. And so these people would come out of the woodwork about, objecting to spending money out of state. And my whole philosophy was the future of our industry would lie in our ability to sell the wine away from Oregon. Because, Oregon has a pretty substantial per capita consumption of wine, but there are not many capitas, and so therefore it's limited. And that you had the pie is only so big, and the more people that come on stream that want a piece of it, it impacts all the other pieces. And so I always would say, think of every case of wine I sell out there is one case less that you have to compete against here. And that was my position through all that time. And I think that it reflects some today. The industry's doing much better in terms of sales away, and so I feel good about those things.
Well, perfect. Well, that concludes the first half of the interview.
My name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Bill Fuller on August 11th, 2015, doing the second part of our interview. And the first thing I want to start with was a couple of follow-up questions to Camille's questions from the first half that came up while I was listening to you. So I'm curious about when you started in Washington County and you were one of the very first, and wine was foreign to the area, basically at that for the locals. What was the reaction like from other farmers or from just the people around the area to the kind of growing wine industry in the 70s?
Well, it was sort of should we say, different levels of curiosity as much as anything else. The farmers were kind of curious. They watched how we planted and prepared the ground, and then you had customer type people, just wine drinkers. They saw there was a little blurb in the Oregonian that somebody was planting a vineyard out in Forest Grove area, and we would get some people off that little article that they were kind of wine groupies, you might say. And then a vineyard out there, let's go take a look and see what's happening. And out of one of those people, interesting thing happened. One of our best friends was created. There was Dr. Robert Bacon. He was a retired professor at the medical school at OHSU. Mm-hmm. And he saw the blurb, but he was kind of a longtime wine collector and wine aficionado. And so he came out one day, and he hemmed and hawed and walked around, and, as we say, kicked the tires. And so then, as time went along and we got a tasting room going, and him and his wife would come out, and then pretty soon it was, gee, Bill, you guys work really hard here. You're running around. We could help in your tasting room sometimes, And then pretty soon he's one of our tasting room employees, But that all evolved out of this little article in the Oregonian about a vineyard being planted in Forest Grove. Because there wasn't much, you had a little bit of vineyard down here, you had Lett and Erath and a couple of others, Marsh, people that had some small plantings, but many of those were tied to Erath. He was really, we talked a little bit about Lett and Corey, but Erath was an interesting person too. He, we used to call him our big teddy bear, he was a tremendous support for the industry, but he was not a boat rocker. He wasn't go rattle a cage. Then where I didn't mind going rattling a cage, but that wasn't his style. And And as a result, he was a tremendous friend to have, in the sense that if you wanted reinforcement of some project you were working on and he believed in it, go get him, and he was really very good, I have to say. So planting the first vineyard, as I mentioned earlier, the guy who came and asked about the green tomato, year of the green tomato. This particular area that we're in has changed in the last 20 years from a lot of orchards. There were peach orchards, there was a lot of filberts, and now it's the nursery interests have bought up quite a bit of the land in that general area, and it's much more nursery oriented than it used to be. In fact, one of the big peach places, this guy had a reputation for peaches, and I remember the first peach season that I was there was that he would announce at the opening, on such and such a date, and cars would be lined up down the road to get in there to get their peaches, But now that's all big nursery situation, But the old timers told me that the filberts were a prophet even during Prohibition and Depression, that period of time, that the filberts paid the taxes on a lot of property, they said, and which was kind of interesting.
Yes.
And there were a lot of filberts in the area where we were at the time.
What would you say the sort of wine education level was like in Oregon when you got here? How much educating did you have to do of your consumers?
A lot. You can't imagine how many luncheon professional clubs type thing that I gave. I gave hundreds of talks, and did a lot of wine tastings with the talks in many cases. And I remember one incident that I just can't forget. There was a group they were like computerized accountants. I forget the name of their organization. Well, they had a rule that you could have entertainment presentation, but you also had some kind of professional presentation. That was a requirement of their meetings. So obviously I'm not the professional uplifting presentation. So anyway, so what I did was I did a little wine tasting at the beginning, then they had dinner, then we were gonna have a talk, and then I was gonna follow up a little more wine story. So this guy sitting next to me, he can hardly get his fork in his mouth. It's like this. And I said, what's the matter? You don't speak to many groups, do you? He said, well, I speak to groups. I said, no, I said, you seem a little nervous. And he said, well, that this group's been drinking. And I looked at him and I said, every group I speak to has been drinking. But anyway, a lot of time was spent educating. We used to, you talk about Chuck Corey we met in those early days, in the early 70s, at the Tiger fire station. They had a meeting room on the side there, and we would meet there. And Chuck was such an arrogance, He would lie on a table, and start telling people the way it was, and nothing embarrasses my intellect more than somebody to talk, down at me from a reclining position. You get ticked.
Sure.
But anyway, that was Chuck. But He had a good story. He planted, had a little vineyard planting business and did plant a lot of vineyards. Have you interviewed Trent Hill? Well, he planted the largest vineyard in Yamhill County, the first one. Do you know Highland Vineyards? Well, the 4 guys that owned Highland, he was their vineyard manager, and he planted their vineyard.
What's his first name?
Yeah. Trent Hill was his last name. His first name. You ask difficult questions. Let's see. Maybe it'll come to me.
No worries.
But he can really talk about establishing vineyards in Yamhill County, because he did it when there was no help. I mean, he was Jack. That was his name, was Jack. And the 4 guys, I think that only, the last I heard, there were only 2 of them maybe still alive. I don't know if you've interviewed any of them.
I think so.
Who owns it now? Dobbs? No. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think that's right.
Yeah. But I made the first wine from that vineyard. The very first grapes that came out of there, they brought them over because I knew the 4 guys that started it and was kind of in touch with them when they were getting started. One of them was a forester with the U.S. Forest Service. One was a builder. One was a ophthalmologist. And the other was just a guy. Some people have no description.
So was there a point at which you felt that your consumers were finally to the point where they were educated enough that you, or was it a kind of a lifelong goal of educating?
Well, I think I had a personal, general lifetime goal of education. I still do it. Last Sunday, some old customers called. We're going to pour your wine from Willamette. And any chance you come by and tell us about it, So if I don't have something that I'm specifically doing, because there's nothing to gain by it. I could say no just as easily, but that's just not me. Ticks my wife off occasionally, but oh yeah, I can do it, sort of thing. I enjoy it. It's my life, It's like, I was retired for 10 years, and then Willamette comes along and wants to know would I make wine again. And, you don't do something as long as I did it, and as intensely as I did it, without missing it when it's gone. It just leaves a big hole right there. And so it's good for an old guy's ego, to get called back.
So tell us a little bit about that. Talk about the kind of evolution of Tualatin, and then how it became part of Willamette Valley.
Well, we were really successful. It wasn't a lack of success. In fact, what's interesting, there's all this talk about Pinot Noir in Oregon and whatnot. The first wine in the Wine Spectator Top 100 Wines was my Chardonnay.
What year was that?
90, I guess. It was 89 Chardonnay, so I think it was 90. But, so there was a bunch of garbage in the Spectator, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago about Oregon Chardonnay. So I sent an email to Harvey Steinman, the publisher, and I said, Harvey, I said, maybe you've forgotten that the first Oregon wine in your top 100 for the year was my Chardonnay, And he sends back, he says, no, Bill, we haven't forgotten. In fact, he said it was your wines that really brought us to Oregon the first time, yeah. But I just chuckle at that when people talk about Pinot Noir. So I would say probably the 2 things that were the kind of the demise of Tualatin if there is such a thing, as one, Malcolmus lived too far away. He saw his friends, he was in a different social economic level than I was, and my wife. So he didn't enjoy the ego massaging that the winery provided his friends that had investments in wineries. Like I said, these people buy lifestyles in these wineries. And so he never experienced that. And then heaven knows I got plenty of it, and that it was almost, I could hardly walk a street in Portland where a lot of people were. There wouldn't be somebody that didn't recognize me because they'd been to the winery, or I'd given one of these 10 million talks that I gave, and those kinds of things. You just see the people, and then that was an issue. And then unfortunately, my wife and I got a divorce about the same time that all this happened, and it was a detraction from the process, and it was too bad. The marketplace wasn't as conducive to selling wineries as it is, or became later, So we didn't do as well financially as we probably should have or could have. But we had a great vineyard. One of the low points of the history of Tualatin was the vineyard foreman, the person who planted the vineyard, basically. I planted the first part plantings because we didn't hire anyone. Then about maybe 2 or 3 years after the first plantings, we decided we needed a vineyard manager. So we hired a fellow, David Foster. He was a Fresno State graduate. He loved the vineyard, and he planted it, and it was great looking vineyard, fabulous. He committed suicide in the 90s. I don't remember what year, but it was a really sad moment in my life, and because he was a wonderful man, and we were close, and I was gone. I'd gone to Europe for a couple of weeks, and did it while I was gone. And so I said something to my daughter about it, who is a social psychologist. She said, well, of course he would do it when you were gone, because she said you would have recognized that it was happening and would have done something about it, and he didn't want somebody to do that. It's a very jealous act, and selfish. Yeah. Anyway, but we had great success at Tualatin. I'm the only winemaker in the history of the International Wine and Spirits Competition to win Best of Show with 2 different grape varieties in the same year.
Wow.
And there was a Chardonnay and a Pinot Noir, and they were entered against about over 1,000 wines from throughout the world, and they came out on top. It was 80 Chardonnay and 80 Pinot Noir and 81 Chardonnay. You've probably heard about the steamboat Pinot Noir thing. That was the first wine that I took to the steamboat. Was in '81. I went the first time, and I took the 80 Pinot Noir. It got a lot of hems and haws, but but anyway, but it did finally come around. That was probably our biggest winemaking problem, and I've thought about this a million times, is that when the wines first come out, everybody puts out their Pinot Noir about 2 years. Okay, we were good, but not with the best. But 5 years later, we'd kick everybody's butt. and this has got proven so many times. There's an Enological group in Vancouver that meet once a month, and they, when the 83s came out, which the 83s were nice wines, they bought a case each of 10 different wineries, and we're talking the top group of wineries, and they included a case of our wine. And so then 10 years later, in 93, they did a tasting of those wines. And they called me and asked if I would be the moderator of the tasting. I said, okay. So we tasted them, and we actually didn't tell people the individual wines. We just told them what the group of wines were, who the brand were, but they didn't know the individual ones. That we wanted them to vote for their favorite wine. And we didn't want names to influence them particularly, but we did feel it was fair to tell them what wines were there. You know.
Sure.
Tualatin came out first. And I mean, we're talking Ken Wright wines, we're talking Irie wines, and we were kind of nowhere with those wines when they came out at the same time. But that was a winemaking problem that we had, and we didn't get a lot of that overripe grape taste in the wines, you know, like Ken Wright has in his, you know, that very concentrated. We were more into the pure fruit characteristics. Well, our wines were so intensely fruity that they tasted young when they were getting older, you know, and you had to wait for that to come around and become complex and whatnot. And that was always a problem. But I guess that it was partly my fault because I never cared for all those jammy fruit bombs, you know. But I like the fresh quality of the wines. These wines that we're making now, that I'm making up at Tualatin, the 13 and the 14, it's been a difficult project in some ways because, you know, the winery has its own problems and demands on its staff and whatnot, you know. So then I'm kind of interjected into that mix. Well, they don't always have people to send up to Tualatin to do something that I want done up there. And so it's almost a step above home winemaking, it seems like, you know. And then things don't happen when I want them to happen and whatnot always. But the wines have turned out pretty good, actually. The first wine they've released is a 12, which I didn't make the base wines, but I blended them. And that's the one that they're selling now. And it with my name on the label and whatnot. And so they're going to release the 13 soon, in September, I think. But the wine's theirs. They do with it what they want. I have no control over that. I just struggle with the winemaking parts.
Do you? And you kind of talked a little bit about this, but do you have a winemaking philosophy?
Well, I guess that it's kind of incorporated a little bit in what we were just talking about, is that my philosophy is to make the wine taste like the fruit and derive its flavors from the fruit and not from manipulation particularly. And so I've always made wine pretty basic, and you know, there's all this talk about organic and natural and this and that. Well, without even promoting that aspect, I've always made wine that way. And that, you know, things are done sort of like they were historically done. You know, and done a few modifications on some of the wines. One of my favorite wines, personally, is Gewürztraminer. And Gewürztraminer is, of course, a tough sell. It's not very popular.
You can't say it. It's hard to buy it.
Yeah. Well, I think that Chardonnay flows off your tongue and Gewürztraminer doesn't. But we planted I don't know, we had about 11 acres, I guess, of Gewürztraminer at Tualatin. And Willamette's just now taking them out because they don't have a label anymore with Gewürztraminer. And, so I kept doing this and doing that, and I spent, I don't know, several trips to Alsace, but I couldn't go at harvest time because that's when I was working. You know? So finally, when Willamette acquired Tualatin, I went to work for them, and so my initial job was I was managing sales for them. You know, old winemakers don't die; they just become salesmen. You know? So finally, I went to Don Voorhees, who was Jim Bruneau's partner, and Jim was off in the brewery thing at that time. And I said to him, "Yeah, fire me." And he says, "Bill, I don't have any reason to fire you." And I said, "Oh, yes, you do. I want to go to Europe, but I also want to collect unemployment." And so I can't collect unemployment if I quit. But so he sent me a letter saying that they no longer needed my services. You know? So I applied for unemployment, and the next day I left for Europe. You know? And so I went right to Alsace, and there's a woman who actually grew up here in McMenamins, was married to a winemaker there, and their family has a winery. The guy does. And actually, Erath introduced me to them. So that's how I met them. And she made arrangements for us to rent a house in their village in Alsace, in Hunnewehr. And so I stayed a week there and sort of shadowed her husband much of the time. And came to the conclusion they were doing nothing different than I was. It had to be the grapes, you know? But I couldn't do anything about that. But I was making the wine just like they were. In fact, it was patterned after many trips going to Alsace and seeing what they were doing. I was doing the same. We sold quite a bit of Gewürz. We sold 2,000 cases a year, which is a lot for a small winery. And it had no future, though, you know, really.
So you've talked about some of the highlights of your winemaking career, but we also heard that you were presented an award by the Queen for one of your wines. You want to tell us about that?
Well, that was the Wine and Spirits Award.
Okay.
The two things, and actually, I didn't go personally. Bill Malcolmus went. I was a little bruised over that one, I thought, because he took a bunch of his friends there, and he told me that I couldn't go. It was at harvest time. And I thought, well, I could have gone for a day or two. But anyway, no, it didn't happen. But the Queen. And actually, by winning 2 Best of Shows, we got these handmade decanters. And the decanter that I got was the Robert Mondavier sponsored one, you know. And then Bill, fortunately we got 2 decanters, because then he took one and I took one, you know. But I was thinking that Jim Bruneau was miffed at first when he got 12th that he didn't get the decanter. You know? But that was okay. You know, he got over it. I keep thinking seriously about my wife, you know, with talking about, you know, there's some memorabilia still that we have, the trophy, the decanter. And I keep thinking that maybe it would be right for Willamette to have it in their trophy case in their tasting room, you know, so more people can see it than sitting on my dining room, you know. But My wife said, well, don't do it yet. So we'll see. So then I got to thinking that I don't have contact with Malcolmus's previous family, but I think Virginia does, my ex-wife, and I keep thinking of talking to her about why not track down that decanter and see where it went, because maybe it's just thrown away somewhere. I don't know where it is. And because his family didn't have a lot of interest in the winery at all. And then maybe we could get that one back and use it, but I don't know if that'll happen or not. But that was probably the biggest award that we got. The Wine Spectator, they're intellectually so dishonest. So we sent them a note. We said, we didn't see anything about the award in London, except, it's the narrow little column thing about a half-inch long or so. And they said, well, that we have an editorial policy that we don't publish a lot about wineries that are not available in our market area. Okay. Next issue. 5 pages of some obscure Italian wine you couldn't find in any of their market area, I'm sure. I think it all boils down to money. Somebody pays, somebody gets, We didn't pay, we didn't get. I'm sure. But anyway, it's like wineries, like wine shops that they only want wines that Parker over 90 or something. That's one person's opinion, and I tasted 2 years in a row now. In the last 2 years, Willamette's had me come and taste when the Parker person tasted. There's been a different person the last 3 years doing the Oregon issue. Plus, this last guy, I don't think that he was a wine person. I think music was his expertise. And, he was pretty hard on Oregon in the issue. And, I think that that whole thing has run its life, personally. You talk about my California career, everyone thinks that Marvin Shanken created the Wine Spectator. That would be most people's opinion, I'm sure. No, there was a guy named Morrison in San Diego that published the first Wine Spectator, and he sold it then to Shanken. Because I met this guy in San Diego. I was at his house and he printed it in his garage. And it was just a little one long kind of operation, and then he had owned that name, the Wine Spectator, and he sold that name to Shanken. A lot of people don't know that, I'm sure.
No.
Because you don't see that anywhere. Yeah.
So you talked about that you're back working at Tualatin now. I know you have other current projects you're working on. Can you talk a little bit about other things you're doing at the moment? I know you're wearing a McMenamins shirt today, for example.
Oh, well, everybody in their career, when they get to my age, I guess, has a job that sort of stands out in their mind as something unbelievable. I worked for McMenamins over a year. And so what had happened was I got a call from their, there's Mike and Brian, they're the owners of the company, but they have 2 guys under them. One does the hotels and the restaurants. The other one does all the pubs and those things. Okay. So the restaurant guy calls me, because apparently Mike had talked to him about a project, and so he called me, and he said that we understand that you might be interested in a part-time job. I said, what do you have in mind? And he said, well, we think that we could sell more wine in our restaurants if our wine staffs were better trained. Would this have some appeal to you? And I said, yeah, why don't you meet with us? So I met with Mike and DJ, the guy's name, and myself. And so they wanted me to work up a program that I could go to the place and make the presentation. So anyway, so I worked up the program, printed it up, showed it to them. They liked it. So they gave me a list, their priority list of places to go, and the phone number and the manager's name. Call them up, make arrangements, and whatnot. So then I told DJ, I said, I think that I would like to go to dinner at a couple of the restaurants where people don't know me, and let me just get a feeling for where we are at. Yeah. So I did the Oregon Hotel here, and I did the Kennedy School in Portland. Well, here, they didn't even have a corkscrew. In fact, they found a corkscrew in one of the women that worked there had it in her purse, one of those kind you pull the handle out and shove it through, the throwaway ones. That was the corkscrew. So then it was a little bit better at Kennedy School, but not much. Because what they did was somebody in the back screwed the corkscrew into the cork, and then they brought it out to the table and they to pull the cork out. So I went back and met with DJ. I said, DJ, no problem. We've got nowhere to go but up. And so then I started. But just think of this job now. I make a phone call, set a date, I show up at that date, I give them 2 hours of bullshit, and I leave. And I'm responsible for nothing. I'm responsible to nobody. I'm all on my own. I mean, what better job could you ask for than that? And I get paid to do it.
And you probably get to drink some wine while you're there,
I get to drink some wine while I'm there, yeah. But so anyway, it was really a great job. Then unfortunately, my current wife, she's a software specialist. And she's sort of the national expert on a particular kind of software called Timberline software. It's an accounting package thing.
Okay.
Well, they needed her in Florida. And so I had to quit because she can make so much more money than I could. So I quit the McMenamins job, and we moved to South Florida for 2 years, to Fort Lauderdale. And but it was just a great job. It was the kind of job I wish I had when I was 20.
Everybody wishes they had that job.
Yeah, right. 20. Yeah, instead of 70. But anyway, well, you can maybe get the feeling from listening to me talk about I've had an exciting life. I could have made a lot more money doing something else, I'm sure. But the point is, I wouldn't have had the life that I have. I was hired as a mathematician by the Livermore Lawrence Radiation Lab. I would have been on computers on the ground floor in 1958, but decided not to do that. But, so I don't know.
I'm curious, kind of going back to what we were talking about before, with the camaraderie in the wine industry, but also the competition at the same time, and the kind of, like you said, the kind of butting heads between different AVAs at certain points. They're kind of, how was the balance struck to make the industry work as a whole?
Well, I think that when we first had wine to sell, okay, now we have wine to sell. Let killed us in the Portland market. I couldn't sell wine to anybody. And the reason, his statement was that we bought grapes from Washington. We didn't make wine from Oregon grapes. There were no Oregon grapes to have. There were none, and our vineyard wasn't producing yet. So we bought grapes from Eastern Washington. Well, anyway, so my first market really was Eugene and Corvallis and along the coast. But then, a typical day to sell wine, I would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning with wine that I'd sold on a previous trip in the car, because you can't sell out of your car. That's illegal. But I could deliver and sell at the same time. So I'd put the wine in the car I needed for delivery. I'd take off, and there was a place in Astoria, the bakery, home bakery, and they were open at 6 in the morning. So I could have a donut and coffee and make my delivery and sell them some more wine for my next delivery time. And I'd start there, and I'd end up in Newport at 10 o'clock at night. That would be, and then drive back home. And so distributors didn't want you. They're not going to spend any time trying to sell your product.
Sure.
So then I went to Safeway. I went every 3 weeks to Safeway. And Safeway at that time was downtown off of Water Street there. Well, that was the year they were building the Clackamas warehouse that they have. And I went for 9 months every 3 weeks. And then on that 9th month, the wine buyer says, "We've decided to take your wine. We want 6 bottle packs, 75 of them. And we want them delivered to Clackamas in 3 weeks," or whatever it was. Their warehouse was just ready to open. So I went home and got my kids lined up, and they started making 6 bottle boxes, because we didn't have any. So we cut other boxes and then tape an end on them, and put them in. So anyway, so then I delivered to the warehouse. I came back. I went down to Safeway, and I said, that you've got the wine now, but I said, the 76 packs, that's not all the stores you have. Yeah, and I said, I must be in only one type of store or something? And they said, yeah, you're in the A stores. Oh, okay. And I said, well, do you have a list of them? Yes. Okay, may I have the list? Yes. So I got the list. So now I was down, actually it was a lobbying project I was on down in Salem. And then I was noticed on the list that said on South Commercial, there's a Safeway. So I go down there, pull into the Safeway store, ask for the manager, give him my card, my song and dance, and he said, well, just a minute. He said that my assistant takes care of the wine shelves. I said, is this your assistant here? Yes, my assistant is here. May I talk to him? Yes. So the assistant comes out and talk to him. And he says, yeah, we've got your wine. It's in the back room. I'm waiting for the Gallo salesman to tell me where to put it on the shelf. I said, oh, but I said, I don't think it sells very well back there, And so that was my introduction to supermarket selling. I'd not done that before. Then in those days, Gallo controlled all the Safeway shelves because Johnny Lemma was a buddy of Al Giusti, who was a buddy of the wine buyer for Safeway. And it was just an old boys group.
Sure.
But I was the first Oregon grape winery in Safeway. No one else. Honeywood was there with 1 or 2 facings of berry wines, but I was the only one, the first one with grape wines. Real struggle. Then eventually I did get into the Portland market. And one of my early selling things was to Weiser and Gene Weiser down in Lake Oswego. And so I go there, tell him about the wines. He orders a case of each. We had 2 wines we were selling. So I said, okay, I'll deliver them next Wednesday or whatever day it was. But so I show up. I set the wine down in the wine department, and you have to get paid by law. There's no credit. So I'd go upstairs to see Gene Weiser and get paid. So I went up there and I said, Gene, where would you like the wine put? He says, well, mark it and put it on the shelf. I looked at him. And I said, what do you mean, mark it and put it on the shelf? I said, I drove my car out to Pasco at 4 o'clock in the morning. I picked up a U-Haul van. I went out to the vineyard where the grapes were picked in boxes. I loaded the boxes in the van. I drove back to the winery. I spent 2 days crushing the grapes and pressing. I had a basket press that I cranked, click, click, pressed 14 tons that way the first year. And I drove the boxes back to the vineyard, returned the U-Haul, got my car, and came back. And now you want me to mark it and put it on the shelf? And he looked at it and he starts laughing. He says, that is kind of funny, isn't it? And I said, it is funny, He said, just leave them on the floor. And I got paid and I laughed. But that did put it in some perspective. But look at these guys today. They've all got money. They got warehouses. They call somebody up and gets delivered, and they have no idea what it was like when we started. It was not easy.
On that note, where do you see the Oregon wine industry going?
Where is the wine industry going?
Where's it going to go from here?
Well, part of me says one thing, but the reality of things is different. And I have trouble seeing the industry to continue to grow and whatnot at the prices the wines are. But I'm a dinosaur. I'm left over from a generation when you were lucky to get $5 a bottle, and so it's really difficult to see. And I guess it's tied into the economy of the country and whatnot. But as long as the market holds at the prices that they're at, and there seems to be some no particular barrier or limit, some people will fall from the wayside. I'm sure they'll have to either lower prices or do something else. But we always used to think of the old pyramid as the price went up, the base got smaller. Mm-hmm. But eventually, there's a place where there's a bottle that only one person will buy, and that probably is still the story, but it's just that the economics have widened the base, with time. But I still think my original concept that selling the wine away from Oregon is where the future is. Now, how you grow that and make money and whatnot, I don't know exactly. I was surprised when I learned recently that A to Z is the largest winery in the state. They're the biggest selling wine in the state. I didn't know that. And the only reason I know is because Don, the winemaker at Willamette, quit Willamette 2 weeks ago and went to work at A to Z as their red winemaker. And he said that A and Z was the largest one. I didn't know that. 300,000 cases.
Wow.
But I think back sometimes to when I worked at Italian Swiss Colony. We would crush 5,000 to 7,000 tons a day. And the red grapes were Zinfandel, Petit Syrah, and Carignan. And now it's probably all Cabernet, or Merlot and Cabernet or something. But so, that you hope that the industry survives and survives economically. That, there are a lot of people who put a lot of energy into it, and I'm one of those. And that you'd like to see that succeed. That I assume you've talked to Kevin Chambers?
He's on the list.
Because he was a really good person and great person to talk to, and has a real pulse of things. that I think of Kevin is I first sold him wine in Eugene. He was a clerk at a wine shop. Then the next time he shows up, he's a part-time wine writer. Then he shows up as sales manager at Benoit's. Then he shows up as in charge of Willamette, the winery in Salem. And I'm interfacing with him along the way. You know, I saw him at IPNC a couple of weeks ago, and I have very strong opinions, as you have heard a few.
We appreciate that. We have a lot of people who don't like giving us many strong opinions. We appreciate hearing strong opinions.
Yeah. Well, the thing of it is that how do you really understand the person if they don't really open themselves up to you? And you know, you're saving something for posterity, and this will give a message to people from now. And you know, the same old milquetoast reaction doesn't give any information, particularly. Then that people can see some of the statements that I made that they don't like. Well, so what? And during my days with the industry, a lot of people didn't like me because I was pretty forceful and strong on my feelings and what the industry should do and shouldn't do, and not everyone agreed. Anyway, what else?
Well, that was all the questions I have. Is there anything we didn't talk about or anything I didn't ask that I should have? Or that Camille didn't ask that you should have?
One of the things that I don't know if you touched upon it, that was an important thing to the industry, it was to all of us kind of personally, was the Enological Society in Seattle. I don't know if anyone talked much about that. It was a competition, and it was just Oregon, Washington, Idaho, British Columbia wines. And it started in '76 because I was involved in the startup. And it was sort of a high point of our year in many ways. And then it became not only, you know, the awards that were given out were important to everybody. That you made a big deal about it if you got a gold medal there, because they usually had good judges, well run. And then it became a social thing for all of us. You know, Erath, Pontes, Volstex, Virginia and I and our kids, and we'd all go up on there. And then on Saturday, we would go down to the boathouse at UW. You know, there's a boathouse down by the stadium. We'd go down there and rent canoes and go across to the Arboretum. And then we would, you know, ground the boats and have a big blast and, you know, a big picnic and potluck thing. And we did that every year. And then we'd attend the event. And so one time, it brings back a memory that after the event, we would go across the street to FX McQuarrie's, you know, across from Seattle Center there, and just trade lies and horror stories and have a drink. And so I'm sitting in there, I forget who I was with, and Ponzi comes in the door and he yells, "Fuller, are you here?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "There's a policeman out there looking for you." You know? I said, "What do you mean a policeman out there looking for you?" He says, "Go out there and see him. He's asking for you." And we told him we thought you were in here. Okay, so I go out there. Well, what had happened was I was staying with Joel and Karen Klein. I don't know if you know the name Joel Klein. He was the first winemaker at St. Michel. And well, his wife was my major professor's daughter. So I've known her since she was a teenager. And Joel was a salesman for GAF. And my thesis had to do with a GAF product and treatment of white wines. So I knew him for a long time. Well, anyway, so they're sitting in the police car, And the policeman says to me, "Do you know this couple?" And I said, "Yeah, I know them. I'm staying at their house." "Oh, do you know where their car is?" I said, "Yeah, I know where their car is." Well, what had happened was Karen, Joel's wife, had driven us in because he had to come in earlier for something. And she drove us into town and parked the car, and she'd forgotten where she'd parked the car. And they couldn't find it. And I thought, Jesus, this guy should be throwing us all in jail, not worrying about where a car's parked. So I got in a police car, and we went over there, and I said, "There's their car." Anyway, it was kind of funny, but just little things like that you think about occasionally that happen. But yeah, but some of the things that we did with Fred Delkin, through the Wine Advisory Board, in one of our first big events was in Seattle at the aquarium. That was very successful. So then the next year, that the tallest building of the Columbia Tower? Mm-hmm. Well, as they were finishing the building, there was a room near the top. I don't think it was the top one, maybe the second one down, that was not finished, but available. You could rent it and hold an event there. And so we did. And we promoted as last year we took you under the water. This year we're taking you to the top of town. And again, that was quite successful. Everyone wanted to see this building anyway and what it was like from the top floor. So we did that. And we did some East Coast stuff. We did a New York tasting and whatnot. And much of this was oriented toward shops and restaurants and whatnot, but we still were looking for distributors, a lot of us, and we would use this opportunity to find distribution with, and that it worked well. We did a San Francisco one, and that was good. So anyway, that's about it.
Well, thank you so much for your time and all your stories and opinions and facts and lies and everything else. We appreciate it.
Yeah, we'll go ahead. It's lies and horror stories.
I like it.